She was made of shadow and silence, a ghost in a palace of polished gold. Bent low over a glass tabletop beneath a crystal chandelier that dripped light like frozen diamonds, she was meant to be invisible. But even invisibility had its own hierarchy. A sharp, mocking voice sliced through the lobby's hushed reverence. "Careful," it said. "You wouldn't want to accidentally polish a guest's $1,000 shoes. We both know you could never afford to replace them." Alara Vance didn't look up, her humiliation a familiar, heavy cloak. The manager waved a dismissive hand, his voice a panicked hiss. "Get her out of sight before the emir's delegation arrives." The street. Regis Grand was not merely a hotel. It was a testament to the impossible, a symphony of marble, glass, and gold, where the air itself seemed to hum with the silent, effortless exchange of immense power. The light from the towering atrium windows was softened by silk curtains, casting a hallowed glow upon surfaces polished to a mirror shine. It was a world built on the flawless illusion of perfection, and every person within its walls played a part. Alara Vance, 29, played the part of the unseen. Her uniform, a simple black skirt and a starched white blouse, was designed to fade into the background. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, functional knot, revealing a face devoid of makeup, a face that asked for no attention. The only color on her was the raw, red chafe of her knuckles, a testament to hours spent with harsh chemicals and abrasive cloths. In her hand, a simple rag. At her feet, a plastic bucket. These were the tools of her invisibility. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace from one gleaming surface to the next. Her work was a meditation. Each circular motion of the rag on glass, each precise wipe along the leg of a gilded chair, was an act of imposing order on a small, manageable universe. It was a rhythm that silenced the cacophony in her mind, the echoes of a life she had meticulously dismantled and left behind. From across the lobby, Brenda Klein watched her from the fortress of the marble reception desk. Brenda, with her perfectly lacquered crimson nails and a designer scarf knotted artfully at her throat, saw Alara not as a person, but as a flaw in the hotel's pristine tapestry. She leaned forward, her voice carrying an intentional, honey-laced venom. "You missed a spot," she called out, pointing a sharp nail toward an immaculate stretch of floor. Alara's movements paused for a fraction of a second. She did not need to look to know there was no spot. It was a game Brenda played, a small, cruel assertion of dominance. Alara simply nodded, her gaze remaining on the table she was cleaning, and wiped the non-existent smudge. To argue would be to become visible, and visibility was a luxury she could no longer afford. She was used to the looks, the way guests' eyes would slide over her as if she were a piece of furniture, their conversations continuing uninterrupted. They saw the uniform, the bucket, the quiet deference, and the assumptions they made were a shield she willingly hid behind. But Alara Vance was not nobody. She was a fortress disguised as a ruin. As she worked, her ears, finely tuned instruments she could never truly silence, picked up the lobby's linguistic mosaic. A French banker complaining about interest rates into his phone. Two Russian women debating the merits of a Fifth Avenue boutique. A burst of Mandarin from a family admiring the indoor waterfall. In her mind, the words translated themselves effortlessly, the meanings and subtexts layering themselves into a quiet, internal database. It was a reflex, an old habit from a time when words were her weapons, her tools, her entire world. A time before she had chosen silence. A soft melody began to drift from the grand piano in the lounge, a Chopin nocturne. The notes, delicate and melancholic, pierced through her carefully constructed walls. For a fleeting, painful moment, she was no longer in the street Regis Grand. She was 17 again, sitting in the velvet darkness of Carnegie Hall, her younger brother Leo's shoulder pressed against hers. He had been vibrating with excitement, his program clutched in his hand, whispering trivia about the pianist's technique. "Listen to that phrasing, Alara," he had murmured, his eyes shining. "He's not just playing the notes, he's telling a story." Her grip on the cleaning rag tightened until her knuckles turned white. Leo. The name was a ghost on her tongue, a wound that never fully closed. He was the reason she was here, polishing the fingerprints of the wealthy off-glass tables. He was the reason she had traded secure government briefing rooms for sterile utility closets. He was the reason she had sworn off telling stories with her own voice. The buzz in the lobby intensified, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The staff moved with a new, frantic energy. Mr. Peterson, the hotel manager, was a wiry man whose face seemed permanently clenched in a knot of anxiety. He darted through the lobby, his eyes scanning for imperfections with the frantic energy of a man anticipating a royal inspection. He spotted Ilara near the main entrance, where she was meticulously cleaning the brass handles of the great glass doors. "Move," he hissed, his voice a low, urgent viper's strike. He didn't use her name. He didn't need to. He waved his arms as if shooing away a stray animal. "The Emir's delegation is 5 minutes out. Do not let them see you standing there. Get to the West Wing. Go." The public nature of the dismissal was a deliberate humiliation. Brenda's laugh, sharp and clear, rang out from the reception desk, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "Can you imagine?" she whispered to her colleague, though the whisper was performatively loud, letting the help greet Emir Jafari. It would ruin the prestige. A few guests chuckled, their amusement a casual, cruel reinforcement of her status. Shame, hot and familiar, pricked at Ilara's cheeks. She lowered her head, the heavy curtain of her hair shielding her face. "My apologies, sir," she murmured to the marble floor. She picked up her bucket and turned, her steps measured and steady, refusing to show the haste of someone who had been shamed. Her retreat was not a rout, it was a tactical withdrawal. She found a secluded corner near a large potted palm, a spot that offered a clear view of the entrance while keeping her cloaked in shadow. From here, she watched the theater unfold. The bellhops stood in a perfect line, their postures ramrod straight. The front desk staff arranged their smiles like porcelain masks. Every employee was a soldier bracing for the arrival of a general. Ilara saw the absurdity of it all. This frantic, orchestrated dance was for one man, Emir Jafari, a name synonymous with oil, power, and the kind of wealth that could shift global markets with a single whispered conversation. A man from a world she knew all too well. A world that had cost her everything. A group of young, self-proclaimed influencers, draped in logos and dripping with gold, were lounging on a velvet sofa nearby, snapping selfies. One of them, a woman with a spray tan and a laugh that grated on the ears, noticed Ilara in her corner. Her eyes, accustomed to scanning for flaws and drama, locked onto Ilara's practical, scuffed black shoes. "Oh my God, look at her shoes," the woman announced to her friends, her voice carrying across the now hushed lobby. "Did you fish those out of a dumpster?" Her companions cackled, one of them making a theatrical gagging motion. The blogger raised her phone, the lens pointed directly at Ilara. "Smile for my followers, honey. Let's show them the behind the scenes of luxury." The air in Ilara's lungs turned to ice. For a single, dangerous moment, the carefully constructed dam within her threatened to break. 1,000 retorts, fluent and cutting in half a dozen languages, rose to her lips. She could have dismantled the woman's fragile ego with a few well-chosen words, exposed her cheap provocations for what they were. The old Ilara, the one who lived in a world of linguistic combat, would have done so without a second thought. But that Ilara was dead. She had buried her, along with Leo. Instead, she remained perfectly still. She did not look up. She did not acknowledge the phone or the taunts. She simply focused on a stray thread on her rag, her entire being concentrated on that tiny imperfection. Her silence was a void, and the influencer's cruelty, finding no purchase, faltered. The woman's smirk wavered, and with a frustrated huff, she turned back to her friends, seeking an easier target for her casual malice. Just then, the great glass doors swung open. A hush fell over the lobby, so absolute it felt as though the building itself was holding its breath. Emir Jafari entered not like a guest, but like a king returning to his court. He was tall, his presence filling the space around him. His robes were immaculate white, his face impassive, framed by a neatly trimmed beard. Behind him followed a phalanx of aides in sharp, dark suits, their sunglasses masking their expressions, their movements economical and precise. The hotel staff snapped into motion. Mr. Peterson scurried forward, his back bent in a deep, obsequious bow. Brenda's smile was blinding. Waiters materialized with trays of refreshments. It was a perfectly rehearsed symphony of servitude. Ilara stayed in her corner, an anchor of stillness in a sea of frantic motion. She was supposed to be invisible, a non-entity, but she could not help but see, could not help but listen. She watched the emir's eyes scan the lobby, cool and appraising. They were not the eyes of a tourist admiring the decor, they were the eyes of a strategist assessing a battlefield. Her own gaze, sharp and analytical, met his across the cavernous space for less than a second. There was no recognition, of course. To him, she was less than the potted palm she stood beside. But in that fleeting moment, a jolt went through her. It was a flicker of the old life, a ghost of the adrenaline she had once thrived on. She saw the tension in the shoulders of his lead aide, the almost imperceptible twitch in the jaw of another. She saw the weight of the secrets they carried. This was not a social visit. This was business of the highest, most dangerous order. She lowered her eyes back to the floor, her heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She had chosen this life of quiet anonymity to escape men like these, to escape the high-stakes games they played where the pawns were real people, where the cost of a single misinterpreted word could be a life like Leo's. The memory of him was sharp now, not soft and nostalgic like the Chopin Nocturne, but jagged and brutal. A mistaken report, a flawed translation from a source on the ground, a drone strike on a market street he never should have been on. She had been the one to read the initial intelligence, the one who had flagged the linguistic ambiguity in the report, urging caution. But she had been overruled by men in a hurry, men who saw the world in black and white, not in the thousand shades of gray that language truly represented. Her hands began to tremble. She clutched her bucket, the hard plastic edge digging into her palm, grounding her in the present. In the gold-plated lobby, in her plain, anonymous uniform, she was Alara Vance, the cleaner. She was no one. She was safe. Mr. Peterson, having finished his profuse greetings, did one last sweep of the lobby. His gaze fell upon her, and a fresh wave of panic washed over his face. The emir and his entourage were being led towards the private elevators, but their path would take them right past her corner. Her very presence was a stain on his perfect welcome. He strode toward her, his face a mask of fury. "I told you to disappear," he whispered, his voice shaking with rage. "Are you deaf? Get out. Go to the utility closet and stay there until I come for you." This time, there was no audience. This was not a performance. This was the raw, panicked anger of a small man terrified of a powerful one. It was somehow more demeaning. Without a word, Alara turned. She walked away from the procession of power, her back straight, her steps unhurried. She did not look back. As she walked, the rich patterns of the Persian rug beneath her feet seemed to mock her. Each intricate knot, each complex design, was a language in itself, a story of craftsmanship and history. And here she was, a woman who held a universe of languages within her, being ordered into a closet because her shoes were not expensive enough. She reached the service corridor, the gilded opulence of the lobby, giving way to sterile white walls and the faint smell of bleach. She pushed open the door to a small utility closet and stepped inside, pulling the door closed behind her. The darkness was immediate and absolute. It was small, cramped, filled with the ghosts of chemical scents. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing in the stale air. This was her place, a small, dark, forgotten space. This was the life she had chosen, a quiet, suffocating peace. But as the sound of the emir's entourage faded down the corridor, an unwelcome thought surfaced in the silence of the closet. It wasn't peace she had found, it was a prison, and she had locked the door herself. The darkness in the utility closet was a thick, suffocating blanket. For a long moment, Alara Vance did not move, letting the sterile scent of bleach and ammonia fill her lungs. This small, cramped space was a microcosm of the life she had built for herself, safe, contained, and utterly devoid of light. The muffled sounds of the world outside the distant chime of an elevator, the faint murmur of conversation were proof that life went on without her, just as she had intended. This was her penance. This was her peace. Her fingers, stiff and cold, fumbled in the pocket of her uniform skirt until they found the worn, smooth edges of a photograph. She didn't need to see it to know every detail. Her brother, Leo, at 15, his face split by a grin so wide it crinkled the corners of his bright, intelligent eyes. He was standing in front of the fountain at Washington Square Park, a gust of wind catching his dark hair. He looked like he held all the world's secrets and was on the verge of telling you the funniest one. He was the reason for this closet, for this uniform, for the crushing weight of this self-imposed anonymity. He had loved stories, loved the intricate dance of words and their power to build bridges or burn them down. And in the end, it was a story, a badly translated intelligence report, a single misinterpreted phrase that had killed him. After his death, Alara had taken the greatest instrument she possessed, her mind, and locked it away in a prison of silence, convinced its power was a curse. A sharp rap on the door jolted her back to the present. "Housekeeping," a muffled voice called. "Need the floor buffer." Alara's breath hitched. She was trespassing even in this forgotten space. She opened the door a crack, her eyes blinking against the sudden assault of the fluorescent corridor lights. An older woman with kind, tired eyes looked at her, surprised. Alara simply nodded, slipped out of the closet, and pressed herself against the wall to let the woman pass. She couldn't stay here. Mr. Peterson had ordered her to the West Wing. Her job, for now, still existed. She retrieved her bucket and began the long, quiet walk, her footsteps echoing softly in the service corridors. She kept her head down, focusing on the monotonous rhythm of her task, rebuilding the walls around her mind with each step. The West Wing was quieter, reserved for private suites and exclusive meeting rooms. The Emir's delegation had been escorted to the Al-Falak Lounge to await their final preparations. As Alara approached, she could hear the low, serious timbre of their voices from behind a set of ornate, half-closed doors. She was meant to clean the antique credenza just outside the lounge, a task that would place her in their immediate vicinity, yet still functionally invisible. She set down her bucket, the soft clink of plastic on marble barely audible. She began to polish the dark, gleaming wood, her movements slow and methodical. And then she heard it. It was not the modern Arabic of business or the classical Arabic of scholarship. It was a language she had not heard spoken aloud in over a decade, a complex and ancient Persian dialect, a variant of the Sasanian court tongue known only to a handful of historians and linguistic specialists in the world. It was a language of poetry, of empire, of secrets kept for centuries. Emir Jafari's voice was calm and resonant. "Speak freely now," he said in the ancient tongue. "No one here could possibly comprehend this. Not the hotel staff. Not any listening devices. We are safe." Ilara's hand froze mid-swipe, the rag hovering an inch above the polished wood. The sound of that language was like a key turning in a long-rusted lock deep within her. It bypassed the walls she had built, striking a chord of pure, academic recognition that was so profound it was physical. For a moment, her mind was a whirlwind of declensions, historical contexts, and phonetic nuances. His aides responded, their voices tighter, more urgent. They began discussing the details of a clandestine deal, the acquisition of a contested oil field near a volatile border. It was a high-stakes, politically explosive maneuver, one that, if leaked, could destabilize an entire region. "The risk of electronic surveillance is high," one aide muttered, his words clipped and paranoid. "If anyone records this, even a fragment, we are exposed." A slight tremor went through Alara's hand. She shook her head, an infinitesimal movement, a silent disagreement with the aide's assessment. Their greatest vulnerability wasn't electronic, it was human. It was the arrogant assumption that knowledge was the exclusive domain of the powerful. She slowly resumed her polishing, forcing her muscles to obey, forcing her expression to remain blank. But her mind was racing, a torrent of memory and analysis unleashed. She remembered studying the dialect under a notoriously demanding professor at Oxford, spending sleepless nights translating fragmented texts, falling in love with its elegant complexity. It felt like a lifetime ago. It felt like yesterday. She was so lost in the echoes of her past that she didn't notice one of the younger aides step out of the lounge for a moment to take a call. His name was Kian, a man whose ambition was a palpable aura around him, sharp and restless. He finished his call and turned, his eyes sweeping the area for anything out of place, and they landed on Alara. He saw not a cleaner lost in thought, but a woman who had been unnaturally still. He saw her proximity to the door. In his world of paranoia and intrigue, coincidence did not exist. He strode toward her, his polished leather shoes, making no sound on the thick carpet. "You," he said, his voice low and sharp. Alara looked up, her expression carefully neutral, pulling herself back from the depths of memory. Kian's eyes were narrowed slits. "What are you looking at?" he demanded, his voice dripping with suspicion. He gestured back toward the lounge. "Do you understand what we are saying?" The question was an accusation, a rhetorical trap designed to intimidate. The room, which had held the quiet hum of power, now fell silent. From inside the lounge, the conversation ceased. All eyes turned to the confrontation unfolding at the threshold. Alara, the cleaner, was suddenly, horribly, the center of attention. Brenda Klein, who had followed the delegation at a distance, hoping to be of further service, saw her opportunity. She glided forward, her expression a perfect blend of concern and contempt. "Sir, I am so sorry," she said, directing her apology to Kian but her glare at Alara. "I can assure you, our staff is trained to be discreet. She understands nothing." Another aide snapped, his disgust unconcealed. To think a common worker would have the audacity to eavesdrop on the Emir. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Mr. Peterson, alerted to the disturbance, came rushing down the corridor, his face pale with sweat. He saw the scene, the furious aides, the silent Alara, the glaring Emir, and his carefully managed world began to crumble. This was a disaster of unimaginable proportions. He didn't ask questions. He didn't seek an explanation. He saw a problem, and Alara was it. "Amira," he began, fumbling with her name before correcting himself with a snarl. "Alara, what are you doing? I gave you a direct order." He grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging into her bicep like claws. He turned to the aides, his voice a frantic, pleading wreck. "My deepest apologies, gentlemen. This employee is terminated. Effective immediately. She will be removed from the premises. This will not happen again." He spun Alara around, his face inches from hers, his voice a furious, spittle-flecked whisper. "You are banned from this lobby. Go to the main storeroom in the basement, now. You are a disgrace to this hotel." Ilara's shoulders remained straight. The grip on her arm was painful. The public humiliation was a burning fire on her skin. But deep inside, a strange, cold calm was settling. She had lived in fear of this kind of exposure for years. Now that it was happening, it was almost liberating. She looked past Mr. Peterson, past the sneering faces of the aides, and her eyes met the cool, impassive gaze of Amir Jafari for a second time. She bowed her head slightly. "I did not mean to overhear," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying easily in the tense silence. "I only know a little of the language." The statement was met with a burst of cruel, incredulous laughter from the aides. "A little?" Kian mocked, his arms crossed. "The language of Sasanian kings? Since when do maids study ancient philology?" The insult was designed to utterly annihilate her, to put her back in the box of being a nobody. But the cold calm within Alara was solidifying, turning into something hard and resonant, like tempered steel. She had spent years trying to erase who she was. And in one afternoon, these arrogant, ignorant men had, with their cruelty, reminded her of it more powerfully than any memory could. She said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. She gently pulled her arm from Mr. Peterson's grasp. She picked up her bucket. She turned to leave, her steps once again deliberate, each one a silent act of defiance. As she reached the end of the corridor, she heard Brenda's sharp, triumphant laugh one last time. She did not flinch. Her fingers slipped into her pocket, her thumb brushing against the worn photograph of Leo. "Don't hide, Alara." A voice that sounded so much like his whispered in her mind. Not anymore. She kept walking, moving toward the basement storeroom, toward the exile she had been sentenced to. But she was not walking in shame. She was walking through the ruins of the prison she had built for herself. And for the first time in 9 years, she felt the faintest glimmer of a coming dawn. The storm they had unleashed upon her was not the one they expected. They thought they were extinguishing a candle, but they had just thrown a match into a powder keg. The service corridor was a sterile path to oblivion. With every step Alara took away from the Alpha Lock lounge, she felt the carefully constructed walls of her anonymity reforming around her, brick by silent brick. She was walking toward the basement, a place of whirring machines and chemical smells, a place where no one would look for her, a place where she could finally, fully disappear. The weight of the plastic bucket in her hand was an anchor, pulling her down into the quiet depths of the life she had chosen. The mocking laughter of the aides faded behind her, replaced by the steady, rhythmic echo of her own scuffed shoes on the linoleum floor. She clutched the photograph in her pocket. It's for the best, Leo, she thought. A silent conversation with a ghost. This is safer. No more words. No more consequences. Back in the gilded cage of the West Wing, a triumphant calm had settled over the Emir's delegation. Kian, the ambitious aide, allowed himself a small, smug smile. The cleaner, the potential problem, had been dealt with efficiently. Mr. Peterson was bowing and scraping, sweat beading on his upper lip as he offered a fresh round of apologies, which the aides accepted with dismissive waves. Brenda Klein stood nearby, her posture radiating a vindicated superiority. The natural order of things had been restored. But Amir Jafari was not smiling. He had not moved from his seat. His dark, intelligent eyes were not on his fawning hosts, but on the empty space at the end of the corridor where the woman had disappeared. He was a man who had built an empire not on assumptions, but on the meticulous observation of human behavior. And something about the cleaner was profoundly wrong. It wasn't just that she had been near the door. It was her composure. He had seen fear in the eyes of kings, panic in the faces of powerful diplomats. The woman had shown neither. Under direct accusation, under public humiliation and the threat of termination, she had displayed an unnatural stillness. Her voice, when she had spoken her quiet defense, had been steady, without a tremor of fear or anger, and her eyes had not been empty. They had been watchful, ancient, holding a depth that did not belong in the face of a low-wage worker. There was an inconsistency, the Emir said, his voice cutting through Mr. Peterson's babbling. The room fell silent. He looked at his aide, Kian. You accused her of eavesdropping. Her response was not that of an ignorant woman. She claimed to know a little of the language. A curious, specific, and utterly unbelievable claim. His gaze shifted, sweeping over the faces in the room. He was a predator who had sensed a strange new creature in his territory, and he would not rest until he understood its nature. He leaned forward, a subtle shift that commanded the complete attention of everyone present. He raised his voice, not shouting, but projecting it with a power that seemed to press against the very walls. It was a voice accustomed to filling palaces and commanding armies. And he spoke once more in the ancient Sasanian dialect, his words forming a complex, archaic sentence that was both a statement and a riddle. Then he issued the true challenge, his voice echoing down the corridor after Ilara's retreating form. Woman, he called out, if you truly understand my words, then turn back. Repeat what I have said, but do not merely repeat it. Recite it in the poetic cadence of the Sasanian court as a scholar would speak to his king. The challenge was so specific, so esoteric, it was absurd. It was like asking a random person on the street to explain quantum mechanics using only Shakespearean sonnets. Kian smirked. The emir was simply making a final, dramatic point, humiliating the memory of the insolent cleaner. But at the far end of the corridor, Ilara stopped. Her back was still to them. One foot was poised to take the next step into the shadows of the service hallway. The bucket handle was slick in her palm. The emir's voice, imbued with the ancient language she had once loved, washed over her, and the final brick of her prison wall crumbled into dust. Leo's imagined voice was deafening in her mind. You carry our stories now. An old tribal woman had once told her in a dusty village under a sky full of stars. Don't let them die in the dark. She could keep walking. She could descend into the basement and live out her days in quiet servitude. It was the safe choice. The choice she had made every single day for 9 years. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the bucket to the floor. The soft plastic thud was the only sound in the universe. She turned, not as a shamed employee, but as a planet turning on its axis, a slow, inevitable rotation toward the light. Her posture shifted. The weary slump of the cleaner vanished, replaced by an innate aristocratic poise she had not allowed herself in nearly a decade. She placed her hands gracefully, one over the other at her waist, a gesture of court etiquette so ancient that no one in the room, save the emir himself, could possibly recognize its significance. She lifted her chin, and her eyes, no longer downcast, met the emir's. They were clear, deep, and blazing, with an intellect that could no longer be contained. And then she spoke. Her voice was not the quiet murmur of a servant. It was a clear, steady, and resonant instrument, filling the stunned silence of the hall. The ancient Persian words, which had sounded merely commanding from the emir, became something else entirely from her lips. They became music. The complex meter, the intricate vowel sounds, the subtle, poetic inflections, they rolled off her tongue not as if memorized, but as if they were a part of her very soul. She didn't just recite the sentence, she inhabited it, breathing life into a language that had been all but dead for centuries. A silver goblet, held loosely in the hand of a junior aide, slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the marble floor. The sound was a desecration in the sacred silence. Brenda Klein's mouth fell open, her crimson-painted lips forming a perfect, horrified O. Mr. Peterson stared, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief, his body frozen in a half-bow. Kian's smug expression had dissolved, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed shock. He looked as if he had just seen a statue weep. When she finished, the last perfect syllable hung in the air like a jewel. A profound, ringing silence followed. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been utterly and violently obliterated. Emir Jafari rose slowly to his feet. It was a sign of respect so profound that his aides instinctively straightened their own postures. He looked at Alara, his eyes no longer merely curious, but filled with a dawning, incredulous awe. He saw her now, not the uniform, not the bucket, not the scuffed shoes, but the formidable presence she had kept so perfectly hidden. "What?" he asked, his voice a low, hushed command. "Is your name?" Before Alara could answer, Mr. Peterson, his programming for self-preservation kicking back in, lunged forward. "Silence!" he hissed, his hand actually reaching out as if to cover her mouth. "You'll be arrested." "You." But his words were cut short by another voice. An older man in the emir's entourage, a man who had remained silent until now, took a shaky step forward. He was General Marcus Thorne, a man with gray streaks in his beard and the weary eyes of a lifelong soldier. He had been squinting at Alara since she had begun to speak, a storm of confused memory gathering on his face. It wasn't her appearance he recognized, it was her voice, the perfect pitch, the flawless cadence, the calm authority, a voice he had heard once before, under the searing pressure of history being made. His own voice shook as he pointed a trembling finger. "That voice," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "The Geneva Security Summit. The crisis with the border translation." His eyes widened, the final piece of the puzzle locking into place with the force of a thunderclap. "My God," he breathed, the name spoken with a reverence that bordered on fear. "You're Nightingale." The name dropped into the silent room like a bomb. Nightingale. Not a name, but a legend. The code name of the ghost-like linguist from the UK's Ministry of Defence, a translator so brilliant she was spoken of in whispers in the highest echelons of global intelligence. The anonymous voice that had, in one long, terrifying night, single-handedly retranslated a flawed treaty and averted a war between two nuclear-armed nations. A person whose identity was one of the most closely guarded secrets in the intelligence community. And she was standing here, in a cleaner's uniform, with a bucket at her feet. The name hung in the air, shimmering and terrible. Nightingale. It was not a name, it was a detonation. The stunned silence that followed was not empty, but thick with the debris of shattered assumptions. In that single moment, Alara Vance, the cleaner, ceased to exist. In her place stood a legend, resurrected against her will in the opulent lobby of the Street Regis Grand. General Thorne took another unsteady step forward, his eyes locked on Alara, seeing not the woman in the drab uniform, but the disembodied voice that had held the fate of nations in its perfect cadence. "It is you," he said, his voice a raw whisper of awe. "We were told you had vanished, retired, no one knew where." The blood had drained from Kian's face, leaving behind a waxy, terrified pallor. He stared at Alara, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of the meek servant he had mocked with the mythical figure from intelligence folklore. It was the primal terror of a man who realized he had casually spat on a holy relic. Every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, now replayed in his memory as an act of catastrophic foolishness. Mr. Peterson's mind was a whiteout of pure static. He could no longer form a coherent thought, only a looping, silent scream of self-annihilation. He had not just made a mistake. He had committed a sacrilege against the twin gods of his world, wealth and power. Brenda Klein, meanwhile, had begun a slow, silent retreat, backing away into the shadows of the corridor, as if hoping the marble itself might swallow her whole. But all of this was just noise on the periphery. The true center of the universe had collapsed to the space between two people, Alara and the Emir. Emir Jafari's gaze was intense, analytical. The shock had passed, replaced by the swift, cold calculation of a master strategist who had just stumbled upon a weapon of unimaginable value. He raised a hand, a quiet gesture that nonetheless commanded absolute obedience. "General," he said to Thorne, his voice calm, "confirm for me what this name means." "Sir," Thorne replied, his posture straightening with military formality. Nightingale was the top linguistic asset for the UK's Ministry of Defence. At the Geneva summit 9 years ago, a critical peace treaty was about to be signed based on a faulty translation. It would have inadvertently ceded a strategic mountain pass, guaranteeing a war within 6 months. Nightingale was flown in. In one night, she retranslated the entire 100-page document from 3 different languages, exposing the error and redrafting the key clauses. She did it alone. Many of us in that room believe she saved tens of thousands of lives before a single shot was ever fired. Then she disappeared. The Emir absorbed this information, his eyes never leaving Alara's face. He took a slow step toward her, then another, until he stood before her. He was a tall man, but for the first time, he seemed to be looking up. "Why?" he asked, his voice now stripped of all artifice, a genuine, quiet question from one human being to another. "Why are you here, cleaning my floors?" The question was the one she had been running from for 9 years. The answer was a raw, exposed nerve. Alara's gaze flickered downward for just a second, to the bucket still sitting on the floor, a symbol of her long penance. "I left that world," she said, her voice soft but imbued with an unshakable finality. "Words have consequences, Your Excellency. I learned that they can cost too much." Her fingers instinctively went to the pocket where Leo's photograph rested, a silent testament to the price she had paid. The Emir understood. He saw the flicker of profound, unresolved grief in her eyes, and recognized it for what it was, the source of both her retreat and her power. He nodded slowly. "They can," he agreed. "But silence also has a cost. A much higher one, I have found." He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon Kian with the weight of a glacier. "You," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "You have excellent eyesight for finding scuffs on a poor woman's shoes, but you are blind to what is right in front of you. You mistake humility for weakness. You mistake silence for ignorance. You are of no further use to me. You are dismissed. Leave my sight." Kian flinched as if struck. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Humiliation, swift and absolute, washed over him. He gave a jerky, pathetic bow and practically fled down the corridor, a man running from the ghost of his own arrogance. The Emir's gaze then settled on the trembling form of Mr. Peterson. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply looked at him, and in that look, Mr. Peterson saw the complete and utter end of his career. The Emir made a small, almost imperceptible gesture to his head of security. "Ensure the hotel management understands the full gravity of their hospitality," he murmured. It was a death sentence delivered in a whisper. Having swept the board of its useless pieces, the Emir turned his full attention back to Alara. "Nightingale," he said, the codename now sounding like a title of nobility. "I am not here on holiday. In 2 days, I will be in a negotiation that will determine the flow of energy to the Western world for the next 50 years. The other side is treacherous. Their words will be traps wrapped in poetry. I do not have a translator. I have employees who speak other languages." He glanced dismissively in the direction his aides had stood. "I need more than a dictionary. I need a weapon. I need an artist. I need a voice of reason that can hear the lie behind the most beautiful sentence. He took a final step closer. The world you left is still here. Wars are still fought with words before they are ever fought with bullets. I am asking you to come back. Not for me, not for money, but because a gift like yours does not belong in the dark, gathering dust. I need you. One more time. It was a command, an invitation, and a plea all in one. He was offering her not a job, but a mission, a chance to prevent the kind of tragedy that had shattered her life. Alara looked at her own hands. They were red and chapped from cleaning chemicals, the nails cut short and practical. But she remembered a time when these same hands had flown over keyboards, decoding messages that saved soldiers' lives. A time when they had held the pen that redrafted a treaty and kept the peace. They were not the hands of a cleaner. They were the hands of a guardian. Leo's smiling face flashed in her mind. He wouldn't have wanted this for her. He would not have wanted his memory to be a cage. He would have wanted her to fly. Slowly, she reached down and untied the strings of her simple, white apron. She folded it neatly, with the same precision she used for all her tasks, and placed it on top of her cleaning bucket. It was a final, deliberate act of surrender, not of defeat, but of surrender to her own destiny. She looked up at the emir, and for the first time, a flicker of light, of her old self, returned to her eyes. "I will come," she said. A collective sigh of relief went through the emir's remaining staff. General Thorne allowed himself a small, proud smile. The emir simply nodded once, a gesture of profound respect. "My car is waiting," he said. As she walked with them toward the main entrance, she was no longer in the lead or trailing behind. She walked beside the emir, a position of honor. The remaining hotel staff stared, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. She passed the grand, floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the lobby. In the reflection, she saw a woman she hadn't seen in 9 years. She was not wearing a crown or dripping with jewels. She was dressed in a simple uniform, but she was standing tall, her shoulders back, her eyes fixed on the horizon ahead. She was not a cleaner, and she was not a ghost. She was Nightingale, and she was finally ready to sing again.